everyone, and welcome to the ICA. I'm Antonia Blocker, I'm the Associate Curator of Talks here, and thank you so much for coming to tonight's talk, here to platform Artist Collective versus Social Network, which is the second talk in our Artist Collective season. I'm very happy to introduce tonight's panel, Ruth Catlow, Lizvlx from overtones.com, Daniel van der Velden from Metahaven, and Ben Vickers, who will be chairing the discussion. Ruth Catlow is co-founder and co-director of Furtherfield, the UK's leading organisation for arts, technology and social change, running since 1997 and opening London's first gallery for network digital art in 2005. Now a dynamic, creative and social nerve centre where upwards of 26,000 contributors worldwide have built a visionary culture around co-creation, swapping and sharing music, code, images, videos and ideas. Furtherfield believe that through creative and critical engagement with practices in arts and technology, people are inspired and enabled to become active co-creators of their cultures and societies. Overtones.com is a Swiss-Austrian-American artist duo founded in 1995 by Lizvlx and Hans Bernard. Their main body of work consists of internet art, installation, video, photography, software art, and performance, and uses the convergence of digital media to produce and publish online and off. Their early works were media hacking projects using low-tech tools to reach very large audiences. Between 2007 and 2011, their focus shifted to research-based productions and video. Since 1999, their work has been shown in museums and galleries worldwide, including venues such as SF MoMA, Furtherfield in Rotterdam, and the New Museum in New York, among many others. Daniel van der Velden is a graphic designer and the co-founder of Metahaven, a studio for design and research who is mostly based in Amsterdam but frequently on the road. Metahaven's books include Uncorporate Identity, published by Lars Muller Publishers in 2010, and Can Jokes Bring Down Governments, published by Strucker Press this year. Metahaven have designed t-shirts, scarves and other products for WikiLeaks and works between freedom of information and overload of information. Daniel is a senior critic at Yale University's MFA program in graphic design and a tutor at the Sandberg Institute, Amsterdam's design department. Ben Vickers is a writer, network analyst, curator, technologist, and Luddite. He makes a living and finds a vocation in understanding how systems of distribution, both human and other, come to affect our personal perception of reality. Ben co-runs Lima Zulu Project Space and was recently appointed curator of digital at the Serpentine Gallery. He is an active member of Edge Riders, leads Brighton University's professional reality development program, and facilitates the development of On Monastery, a new kind of social space designed to serve the local communities of towns or small cities throughout Europe in solving key social and infrastructural problems. That's enough of me reading at you, so please join me in welcoming our panel.
Okay, first of all, if you use Twitter, the hashtag is ICA debate, and throughout the talk and conversation, I'll be fielding questions. So if you want, just to kind of try and develop a bit more dialogue between audience and panel.
Is there Wi-Fi?
There is Wi-Fi. Yeah, you should be able to get it. You can't get it on stage. Okay. So to start, I'd like to focus on the title of this talk and immediately make an assertion. Social network doesn't mean social media, it doesn't mean Facebook, LinkedIn or Grindr. It means a set of social relations that constitute a network form, like a family or a group of friends or an artist collective. But if we take the proposition of an artist collective versus social network at face value as kind of two combative forms of organisation, then some interesting antagonisms might arise. I think it's useful when dealing with what can be complex and sprawling ideas, such as the impact of recent technological innovation, or the idea of the artist collective, for which there is a very strong mix of personal investment on the part of quite a high diversity of individuals, that we kind of, I attempt to set some parameters for discussions and the aims for what we might address in the course of this discussion. So, in context, we're here because of the Bernadette Corporation, an artist collective, a collective that flaunts insurrectionary desire and fetishizes the overthrow of capitalist production. Maybe this is a radical proposition. It deals, though, in a geopolitics and collective struggle. With this in mind, I'd like to bring in another corporation, the RAND Corporation, which is a non-profit right-wing global policy think tank, who produced a set of interesting reports during and around the time of Bernadette Corporation's initial formation that could provide a number of parameters for discussion that the panellists are free to engage with or totally disregard. In a report in 1996 titled Tribes, Institutions, Markets, Networks, a framework about societal evolution, the RAND Corporation makes the case for networks being an evolutionary form of societal organisation. And they define this within the TIMN framework, which is as follows: the kinship-based tribe, as denoted by the structure of extended families, clans, and other lineage systems. The hierarchical institution, as exemplified by the army, the Catholic Church, and ultimately the bureaucratic state. The competitive exchange market, as symbolised by merchants and traders responding to forces of supply and demand, and the collaborative network, as found today in the web-like ties among some of NGOs devoted to social advocacy. One of the questions that I'd like to pose within this is, do we believe this idea of a kind of societal evolution towards a better form of societal organisation? And does the contemporary collective represent the early clannish form or the evolutionary form of the network? Or are these things even mutually exclusive? Just to draw it back a little bit, why present an expanded perspective of this nature? Kind of like macro view of the world, particularly in an art context. Is it fair to kind of begin to make these demands of art, or to make these demands of artist collectives? Are these the desires of artists? Can you even begin to generalise in that way? One of the reasons why I've focused on these points is because it's very much in the context of the Bernadette Corporation, which in some ways this show serves almost as a full stop to some of the stuff that they were pursuing. I'd like to posit that what RAND suggests in their analysis to some extent is true, and that the stakes are much higher now, and that there is more to gain, and with that a greater responsibility in this moment for groups that propose a collective form in the arts or in any other area of civic life. But I don't really believe that it's also always useful to operate at a kind of macro level. And in this respect, I think maybe it'd be useful to bring it down to a kind of human level, and this can be summarised in a point that Ruth made in an email to me this morning, which I'm going to quote directly, which is to say, the most pressing question of contemporary life is how do we negotiate the tension between the interests and freedoms of the individuals and the collective? Collective in the wider sense of the word, the total mass of human beings. This is a political question, and it is also a question of freedom and imagination. So, from there, I'm going to pass it over to you, Ruth. If we could go around, and everybody has like 2 to 5 minutes just explaining a little bit of how their work might be reflected in this, and initial points of disagreement might be a useful way to start.
Okay, I think it's worth just saying a little bit about the beginnings of Furtherfield, just so you get a sense of where I'm coming from. We started out as artists in London as Brit art was really powering up. Brit art made London feel like an unfriendly place for me and the other artists that I knew to kind of be in, because it deadened a lot of critical discussion. It pulled all the attention to one place that then got sucked up into the media. It was sponsored by the marketing machine, by the Saatchi marketing machine that had also been responsible for getting Margaret Thatcher into power, so it had all these kind of very clear political underpinnings. And we encountered the internet and could teach ourselves to create things in a new public space and connect with people who, it was a space that you could form yourself. So one of the things that obviously this space is, I've never heard that kind of set of the tribes, institutions, markets and networks from the RAND Corporation. I really recognised that. That felt really interesting. But when you're just coming to the network and you're using this kind of the sets of protocols, simple codes, and the new experience of connecting with people in new ways, and very often, of course, distances of social, geographical distances, and you're meeting people and you just really have no idea, and you have no way to know really how to behave with each other. That's a very quite powerful moment, I think, for artists. So, and the actual form of the network was at that time and continues to be very inspiring, I think, for artists, because the internet is a place where you make stuff, you distribute it, you discuss it, you remix it, you reshape it, you make the tools that you use to remake it. So and everything happens in the same space, and that space is made up of people, machines, hormones, ideas, politics. So all these things are all happening in the same space, and you can kind of really leap across these kind of different distances. We were half joking before we came here that kind of Ben had really set a trap for us all. And I'd said to him earlier that he'd kind of been using the Artist Collective as a straw man for the purpose of this discussion. And I'm feeling slightly less kind of got at now after your introduction. But I think the Artist Collective really isn't a single thing. And I'm not sure. Certainly taking the Bernadette Corporation as a kind of, if we say, okay, this is a collective, then that is a far less interesting thing for me to think about than all the different kinds of examples of artists forming groups which might be very temporary, semi-permanent, enduring, and then collaborating with each other. And why at this moment, and I think you're right, we're in a very important moment, it's important that artists are taking exploring what these networks can do, is that we need to understand how to collaborate with each other, and that what we want is artists really experimenting freely to see what then comes up. And the kind of social, if we then posit that set of practices that are ever changing, ever self-defining, who knows what's going to happen, against the frameworks of things like Facebook, where the infrastructure is very clearly set up for a kind of profit motive. It's harvesting our social interactions. If we decide that all kinds of social interactions can only be are only valid or only innovative if they are profit delivering, we really limit the evolutionary potential of the network. And I think networks are the power tools of our kind of contemporary society, and we all need to have our hands on it. And that's what the internet's. It promises what we don't. It's yet we're going to see what it delivers on it. And I'll shut up.
Yeah, sure. So I will follow your example, Ruth, and just talk a little bit about how Metahaven came into being. Basically, Vink and I started Metahaven as a sort of evolution from the idea of the design studio. The design studio ultimately is a place inhabited by designers and a telephone, and the telephone rings, the designer picks up the telephone, and then receives an assignment. That is the basic structure of a design studio. And we felt that especially the investigative side of that is really necessary for design to renew itself was kind of missing from that, by default studio model. And it was something that we felt, we should do or try to do with Metahaven, to actually, besides answering questions, also ask questions. And to do that, we assumed, I think, a collective form, but we also assumed a few, a few properties that the network form and the collective form have in common, which is to say a lack of hierarchy in the collaboration, and a lack of institutionalization of your own being as an organization. Yeah. That said, so actually this image has been up for really long, but this is some work. Anyway, since no one is showing anything, I'm just gonna go through it really quickly. Okay, well let's leave it here. And then, being invited for this debate, I thought a little bit more about the notion of what makes a network form of organization disruptive, and what makes the sort of the older forms, collectives, but also bureaus, firms, etc. What made them convenient, and why are they failing now, right? So I made this little diagram, and for me the most problematic thing about the organizational form that is kind of centralized, whether it's in a collective or in a bureau, is its low social mobility and its low situational agility. So I find that in times like these, there is a situational agility needed for actors to be able to respond and to propose really quickly. And then if that has to be filtered through traditional organizational demands that are posed on the members of the organization, there's a sort of problem there. Whereas networks do have a high social mobility and a high situational agility. But of course, networks, which also include secret think tanks and non-permanent membership clans, depend on a willingness and ability to work under unconventional circumstances, right? And one other problem, I'm not sure it's a problem, like the old forms, the convenient forms, were in normal circumstances easy to monetize. Like the design studio was an easy to monetize labor form. It was, you sit behind a computer, you have your phone with you, the phone rings, and there's your assignment. Great. But in terms of transition, crisis, and emergency, those rules change. And then what was a convenient form becomes a form that's harder to monetize. And basically, the network form at this moment is still difficult to monetize, I guess. Otherwise we would have also been having this discussion. We all still told you would be, announced as a curator of digital for this and this network instead of for the Serpentine Gallery, or you wouldn't have that title at all. So both structures, old and new, the one in decay and the other in advance, require transitional forms of support. Commissions, education, public speaking, secret side jobs, etc. So what we are becoming now, I guess, is we're all becoming our own Live Nation. So the Live Nation is an organization that monetizes the entire structure of the music industry, from record producing to live performances. And in a way, we are drawing on all these things permanently and in parallel in order to keep this, transition going. But then again, it could be a transition from an old structure. It could be both. It could be keeping the old convenient structure running as good as it, is, or it could be about going towards some sort of more networked, more disruptive idea of organization.
So I guess it's my turn now. You said I'm not supposed to say I don't know why I'm here, so that really raised the question for me. Why the fuck am I here? Ubermorgen.com is not an artist collective, it's a duo, so. But we don't always like each other that much. Do we want to work together? So we end up, finding other partners to collaborate with. And we got started, when kind of 1995 situation where lots of, net art got started. And I personally, I just feel like, it's, there is a network there, right there. All the people that kind of got started in 1995 constitute like a very global network of artists that you can very much rely on. You can either rely on them being assholes or being potential really good friends or actual really good friends. That's something you don't need to monetize on. And so I think that's a kind of network that is really important. But there's just one thing, network, and even if you say, it doesn't have to do with Facebook and so on, but still there's like this word that's really close to it, and it's, the word community. And I don't think there's maybe like 10 words that I really don't like, and community is one of them. Because what the hell, seriously. Community always means to me like the lowest common denominator equals boring or whatever, or, just let's not fight. Let's just agree on something that is totally uninteresting, something like that. And that's what Facebook is in the end. And that's why I even like it, because it's, if you feel like you're boring, go on Facebook, and it's also boring. You're not being challenged. It's awesome, yeah. But it's totally unusable for any kind of artistic practice, unless you want to fuck with it, obviously. And I think by now this is also true for lots of, for pretty much all of the internet life. To me, the internet by now is like the most self-censored and censored space that exists in this world. I mean, there's specifically self-censored medium. I mean, it's incredible how inhibiting the internet has become. It's not the internet's fault. I still totally love it. Has not ever done anything to us. We're doing something to it. And I mean, there's just one thing that I do like, which is Twitter, but it's just getting. But there's like the second thing I want to come to. You need some kind of expertise to network with other people. I mean, obviously some social expertise, which lots of people just really don't have. And I mean, there's a huge nerd fraction that's an issue with any kind of social interaction. But can interact if it's on a kind of digitalized network. So that's helpful sometimes, right? You don't want to meet them in real life sometimes. What I'm trying to say basically is we have used remote collaborations, any kind of form, like a really, as you pointed out, like non-permanent and flexible, and collaborating with people that we neither knew where they were or what their names were, and some because it's clearly not interesting. It's only about the outcome. Since all these new, since about 2001 and so on, since all these new terror laws have come into effect, and basically they always state, like, if you conspire to plan or even talk about something that is potentially illegal, you're already considered some kind of terrorist mafia, and that really makes it impossible to collaborate with other people if you want to, if you have an art practice that's rather, radical, I guess. I mean, I don't consider whatever I do radical, because it's just stuff that I'm interested in. But seriously speaking, because from stuff that we have done in the past, we know that we keep on getting sued for it all the time. So, I'm not interested in being like this stupid idiot that just puts herself out there and gets sued, and everybody else like saying like, oh, that's awesome, she's cool. I'm like, yeah, but I'm paying the bills. I'm not paying them anymore, it's just in debt. But which is helpful. But I think it would be wrong. So if I am collaborating now or in the last few years with people, it's in real life. Because it's better. The other option is only to go, go total, down the lane of security and install your Tor browser and make everything super safe and communicate that way. And that's fine, but it's a different thing. Especially because there's always some idiot on it that just forgets about it and makes stupid mistakes, and then it's fade, and it doesn't work anymore. And I don't trust people that much.
Okay. Use cryptography, right? Okay, so if I jump in, the connection I saw, I might veer a little bit off topic, but kind of interested in how it functions now, because you spoke a little bit about the community that existed in the 90s and how you're still connected to that community, and you don't like the word community, network, and you spoke about how Furtherfield was very much involved in that kind of early investigation into networks and stuff like that, but was like flawed by Brit art and all of that kind of stuff. But evidently, in this moment, and the reason
spurred on by Brit art.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Fueled by it.
Fueled by it.
And evidently, like now we're sat on a stage speaking about like potentially people coming to the talk might be excited that we're going to talk about social networks and what that means for like the democratization of art and all of that kind of territory that you hear kind of bandied about, particularly in the context of recent Nesta reports that talk about the wonderful creative economy and stuff like that. I'm just kind of interested in, because you just spoke a little bit about tools, but where this division comes in terms of what collectives or individuals that are working in a space where they're creating their own tools and not have the technical understanding of that stuff, and then what might be termed now as post-internet, where you have a younger generation of people that are using platforms like Tumblr and Photoshop and stuff like that to produce stuff that does represent very much that same excitement that you talked about when you meet people for the first time. That's like being relived again, but through a totally different set of filters. And I just, if you comment or...
I'll say something before I forget what it is that you've just exploded in my head. Okay, so if we think about, because we got started around the same time as you did, so what you say about still having that network of people who you met, them still being the people that are quite important in your network, that is also true for us. So some of our kind of strongest friends were made at that time. Part of the reason I think that that those bonds are still very powerful is because we were probably the same kinds of people who were looking to explore a space that didn't know what it was going to be, that was interested in making an alternative context on its own terms, that could in some way, was excited by the idea that you could shape the kinds of relationships that existed in the work and between the people that you were working with. And I kind of, on my way here, I made a list of all the people who might kind of fall into collective or groups, and they spread right across when I look at them, you have Venus Matrix quite early on, so feminist cyberpunks who were using moves and nods and moves to behave badly and think about what the kind of promiscuity, bad language, kind of being bad women in this space. And then you also had, I was looking at Superflex, who don't describe their projects as art, they describe their projects as tools because they understand their work as things that change, that they create actions in the world. Then you have artists like Mongrel, who then became Yohara, or the record software group, who are kind of really working with the code. And again, those works are very important and interesting and still very resonant. The work and they're still working. We still have young artists coming up like Icozy and Modder, and there are lots of people who still find it important to work with the technology to make new kinds of relationships and make it possible to connect with people and things in a different way. That's still very important. If we move to people working with Photoshop, Tumblr, all of those things, I think, it's what people are doing with them is what's really important. We've just been looking at an artist at Furtherfield, Jennifer Chan, so it becomes more relevant, I think, for artists to be exploring the tools that everybody has access to, because these then become the materials of everybody's life. But it is what you do with it. So Jennifer Chan's kind of doing a kind of interrogation of, I think it's an Zizek term, of interpassivity. So this idea that we're all involved in both a kind of performance of the spectacle, a performance of interaction that is just completely disempowering and promotes a kind of ennui amongst us all. So we're all kind of, oh God, this is really interactive, but there's how much of it's actually it's actually engaging, we're not quite sure. So there's a ton of material out there, a kind of exploring of human values and what this material is doing to us and what the technical infrastructure are doing to us in connection with all the people who are controlling these things. And so it's important that these things remain our materials. And last point, there was a controversy last year about around the new aesthetic, and I was kind of pondering it, and there's loads of really interesting stuff published on the new aesthetic blog. And then I was thinking, why has this really got people so irritated? what's wrong with this? Why it didn't feel like an artistic project. So look it up. There's lots of really interesting stuff there. But I went and had a look at the manifesto, and it described itself as a mood board for future products. And I think that where there are problems, sometimes, you know, we aren't just commodities, we aren't just producers of product. Those things have a place in our current world. Maybe they won't in the future, I don't know. But that just seemed, so then I understood why people were so irritated, that these were being presented as the nuance.
And you don't think it's trolling?
What?
The new aesthetic. It's a massive troll project.
I don't know. Maybe.
Sorry, that's going to throw us off in a different direction. But to draw it back to, you touched on infrastructure and tools and stuff like that, and it seems like that would be an obvious place to bring Daniel in terms of what you laid out at the beginning in terms of considering these kind of organisational forms and how they're constituted as infrastructure and who owns that infrastructure. We're kind of involved in a conversation. There's a much broader conversation about the nature of this infrastructure and how it's connected into everything we do in everyday lives. I wondered if you wanted to jump in there, because I think there's a crossover with the tools.
Yeah. Now, first to challenge a little, I was first quite skeptical to be in this conversation at all, as you knew, because I feel that the most important things that we do are the actual actions, and to some extent they are self-evident. You know, by what we do, we actually say what we mean. But you know, to talk about Tumblr and Photoshop in the same sentence is actually quite interesting, because you call both platforms. But maybe I'm really behind on this, but as far as I know, Photoshop is a proprietary software program, and Tumblr is a free blogging service. And there's a wide difference between those two. I think if you say, okay, collect network form doesn't mean Facebook, it's a really good line. You know, it's true. It's not about Facebook, but it's about means of coordination. So the first thing that a network needs in order to become more than just a loose collection of people who know each other is a collective form of coordination. And right now, there's a wealth of by default options to coordinate, which makes it really tempting to think that networks are about Facebook. But Facebook or Twitter are the things that make it possible for a non-organization to behave like an organization temporarily. And I guess, secondly, membership in networks is kind of voluntary. So also stepping out of a network is a voluntary act. So I think in times of big uncertainty like now, it is first of all for many people it's attractive to have a certainty. So something like a job or something that they can pay the bills with. Then in Holland you see this very strongly with graphic designers who desperately want to teach now. Whereas in the past teaching would be something, practice is important. Teaching is something on the side. Teaching now becomes a major source. If here's your job offer, travel to Switzerland every week, be 8 hours in the train to teach in Luzern in Switzerland. People do it. They do it. So that's one thing. They adhere to the fixed old forms. But then, if you don't have these things on offer, it's much more attractive to not commit to anything. Instead of maybe the only thing that you actually commit to is to a network where temporary structures arise but also disappear. And one question you asked in the preparation for this event is, do we need to create our own lightweight institutions? That was a question that you asked, but don't think you said it publicly here. I didn't say it publicly, but. Yeah, but of course, the threshold of institutionalization of a network, to some extent. I mean, there's a great talk by Eleanor Saita and Smart McCarthy about institutions done at the conference in Berlin, the hacker conference. And they say basically institutions contain tacit knowledge. They are ways for us to remember over a longer period of time. And that is really an interesting proposition as well. Yeah. So I don't have a final word on infrastructure, but I know that next to networks you need something else as well. You can't do it with only networks, I think.
Do you, in that context, do you distinguish Furtherfield as an institution or a network? And how do you make the definition between those two things? And
depends who we're talking to. I mean,
Funders?
we'll describe ourselves very differently to different people. Because, I mean, especially since our gallery moved to the park, it's become really, it was always really important to us that when we opened the door, anyone who came in would have a way to walk through that door and feel like they were welcome. We're very friendly, so you may find community boring, it's good, and you can have great fights.
I was talking about the community and art practice. That's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
I think community just kills out.
Yeah, I think community is great as long as you're allowed to fight. I think you can fight in your community. You have to have really good punch-ups.
Yeah.
But what I was saying is that, you know, it really depends who's just walked through the door and asked what we do as to how we describe ourselves. And institutions, like you say, institutions are important for kind of longevity. And then there are some really horrible institutions that just perpetrate horrors over a very long time. And there are some wonderful institutions. You know, there are some new institutions or foundations forming at the moment that I think are doing really important work, like the Network for Peer-to-Peer Alternatives. There's really interesting politics and building of new kinds of thought and philosophy and practice going on there. And it's really important that these things happen and sustain themselves. It isn't like something that only lasts for a second is inherently better than something that lasts for 30 years. It just seems silly to me.
And sorry.
You said something before that I wanted to understand, maybe, and you were saying like democratizing art. Like, what's that notion? You want to bring democracy and art closer together?
I'm not suggesting that as like something that we want to do. But I said it because a lot of the time. I think that what a lot of people, and I mean a lot of what there was that sense in early net art that there was this kind of this opportunity to expand to a broader audience.
But that has nothing to do with democracy, though. It was
very
very clear. I'm the freaking sender, and you're the user. Or I call it was a compiler versus, and the user, not versus, but anyone it can become, a compiler or a sender, obviously. But democracy and art, I mean, doesn't really mix. You maybe creates culture or whatever, but I mean, the moment you start democratizing art, I mean, that means it has to be, likable to a broader audience, and that means it cannot be innovative or radical or anything anymore. But I'm just getting at it because that's something that people by now you just say like that. I don't mean that you just say it like that, but it's.
But I do say it like that. I do say it just
but
like
it's
because
extremely stupid.
I know. I agree. I absolutely agree. The prospect.
But everyone was like, democracy is going to solve everything. It's like there wasn't even any problem before people started democratizing shit. Just let it be. Sometimes some people are just stupid and other people are smart, and some of them people are supposed to listen, and the other ones give them room to talk. And fuck democracy.
Okay, I don't know if I completely agree with that sentiment, but a lot of this. I'm listening. I'm just going to talk over the top of you. Democracy in motion. But I think that that's something that's bandied around a lot of the time in respect to things like Tumblr and stuff like that. And I believe it to be a total fallacy. Like it's just not true.
We're running out of attention. That's the problem. So
Present shock.
Yeah, it's always been it's always been a market of attention since that art started. But I also like what you were saying, like why does this network of net art still exist? Because it was kind of like people, and I think the reason why people got into doing net art or just whatever stuff on the web was because it was a space where you could just do stuff and nobody really was paying any attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really, really free. And that's why sometimes now it just doesn't make any sense to put your own experience and your own practice online.
I think
because it's changed so much. You can still, we've done it 2 years ago. We did a secret project because we still wanted to do something. We were really interested in working on this whatever issue, but we figured if we produce it and distribute it under our own brand name, we're just gonna get legally shut down, get into trouble, and it's gonna be about something else again.
Okay.
And so I think it's, what I'm saying is, also in the organization of networks and institutions and so on, it's all important. But institutions at the same time are, of course, sometimes very helpful for any artist, clearly. But at the same time, they're friend and foe.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, at the moment money becomes, a bit tense, they're rather on the foe side.
Mm-hmm. You talk about that, having to do secret projects and stuff like that as a frustration, or kind of talked about it with a degree of frustration, but I kind of understand that kind of migration to doing secret projects, doing stuff under other names. That's something that's very much like born of like understanding how this network, how a broader network functions under like conditions of distribution and stuff like that. So I think for a lot of artists that aren't in contact and didn't formalize their practice around code or sharing things online with a distributed peer group, that they're not increasingly not aware that there are these alternative models of distribution, and that in itself kind of represents that kind of practice. Like, does that? And it's actually a positive development.
Routes
in a way.
of communication are like 70% illegal, anyways.
But also,
it's not yet. You don't have to be on Facebook. But if you're not, it's almost like it's all. That's already strange. I mean, if you're just a regular person applying for a job or whatever. But if you're, that kind of, you know what I mean? So if you really go down an alternative route, you're kind of suspicious in the first place.
But it's not an alternative route where it's exclusively that route. It's like I'm doing this distributed way of working because, and for example, like the book that you produced with DSG, like 2 weeks ago for Auto Italia, that's something that just exists in the gallery, and you have kind of paste bin and all of that kind of stuff around it. But you also operate a Twitter stream and a design studio and produce for presumably corporate clients.
Well, corporate. I think we should all be a little bit more realistic and concrete here, right? Because we're not like this sort of super corporate design group, not at all. In fact, the most important thing about the Void Mystique DNA book with the territorial support group is its ISBN number. So that is the way that the thing is. It is actually an object that lives in the system because of its ISBN number. So that is an important feature. I guess that a nice example is actually WikiLeaks to talk about organization, because they've gone through so many changes in how they define themselves in order to deal with the perception of the public. So there has been this frantic drive to first be totally faceless. Then after collateral murder in April 2010, they become a media-friendly organization with a figurehead and press conferences, etc. And then they start to talk about themselves as an organization, really concretely. But whereas the actual form of that organization is much closer to a tribe than to like what you would say is an organization. So maybe the Rand Corporation was right. As they've been right later on. I mean, just the Networks and Net Wars book by Arkila and Ronfeld, another classic Rand book, also talks about how conflict is being transformed into this kind of idea of asymmetrical conflict and things like that.
But and one of where there is potentially promise in the Rand reports is that it highlights that this shift towards networks is actually good for NGOs and the civic side of society, and this is something that is really of contentious debate now, because like we are shifting to this moment where it's almost advertorial to talk about networks for the benefit of the big society and things like that. And Rand was certainly reporting on it, and lots of government agencies would have read all the Rand reports and all the ones that aren't in public circulation now that are extremely advanced. But I get the impression that we generally on this panel still hold some hope for that form.
Well, we're still using them.
Yeah.
And they're still valuable to us.
Yeah. but at the same time we're being invited here, like we're flying in through EasyJet, you know, we're checking into our like incredibly tiny hotel rooms, you know, so we're also a sort of, we're also middle of the road, you know, mid-career speed metal band musicians, you know. No, right. No, but I mean, I'm not saying this in a negative way, but we, you know,
No, but I think,
it's also making. It's also a question of making do, you know, with the things that present themselves to some extent.
And I think that's kind of quite an essential point in terms of like a degree of honesty around people who operate in a network space and the kind of sometimes branding strategies, the kind of it's not a lie, but you can find yourself in weird situations like this when and that's something kind of new and odd as a result of the kind of fronting or.
It's very easy to find oneself misinterpreted because everything moves so fast. The internet culture moves so fast that that's why it's really important for us that we see young artists coming up and kind of making these connections and still doing the reflection, the kind of reflection on what it means to be a kind of thinking exploratory being in the internet and in the networked age where working with the tools or working with the medium or working with the ideas or working with politics is still really important. Because I also meet a lot of young people for whom it's quite possible that they think Facebook is the internet, and that is quite scary to me because of where I've come from. And that sometimes I might want to sit down and have quite a long conversation, and that's a very interesting conversation, but it is. That's why we still need these things that disrupt it and pull it apart. Is because if people actually think Facebook is the internet, then we've lost a whole load of things.
In the interest of the network, should we throw it open to questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Read the hashtags.
There should be a microphone moving around.
I just said read the hashtags. There's lots of questions in the ICA debate.
Okay. There's lots of trolling in hashtags. It's not trolling. Oh, okay. Maybe this is a good question that we can have here. What's the point of advertising an open debate if the discussion is confined to an enclosed environment? Guys?
Totally on point, right? Like the setting is very hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we should do as Frank Zappa once did, and have the audience, like there was less audience than band members, so the audience took the stage and the band became the audience. Yeah.
I tried that once.
Yeah.
It was okay.
Did it work?
Of course. What do you think?
Okay. What if democratization took communist democracy as a model, direct democracy?
Again?
Communist, yeah. Instead of having like a consensus model that you get a sort of mediocre outcome, a form of direct democracy is proposed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, communist democracy.
I think.
This tweet comes from this room.
I'm going to be honest.
It's not like.
Yeah.
It's not like people.
Explain.
I think this would work better if we do have people ask questions directly on the microphone.
Otherwise, we'll have a voice.
No, I think we need to use Twitter to communicate amongst us.
Yeah, we need to pass this through the US cloud.
I do think so.
We can't have this conversation
Twitter.
unless it's passed through servers in California.
Otherwise, we can't be monitored. You know, it's not good.
No, we're not being managed.
No, but if you go via Twitter, we are.
Go.
We might be.
This is working always, are. They just can't do anything with the information.
The non-content information will be monitored.
Sorry, I've got a loud voice. Yes, tweet it. I mean, I was just wondering,
because this is to do with collectives as well, isn't it, and how kind of artist collectives come together. I was just wondering, what difference does it make when artist collectives come together in a way that's very visible and public? So, for example, on Facebook, let's say, you can see, even if you're not necessarily part of their network, you can kind of see groups of people in terms of who's commenting on who and who's in which shows and who's going to certain things. So there's a kind of a certain amount of publicness in a way that maybe in the past with artist collectives there wasn't. So collectives were kind of formed a little bit more under the radar. I don't know.
How are you defining a collective?
I don't know. Sorry, the question just came just because that was in the title of the talk.
No, I mean, I think that's a really important point, particularly in respect to now and watching how people. I mean, I think that was one of the main reasons why I left Facebook. It was my main feed for looking at artwork, and it created such a large amount of noise as you'd see people go through a very well articulated and very strong strategy for boosting one another up, and I think that at times it does come to constitute something that looks like a collective, but I think that it doesn't necessarily benefit the discourse and the production of work and the strong ties that are generated between individuals. But also I think there's also that strong fallacy between what technology does and what happened before and whether those things are different, and I think actually most technology just makes visible what was there before. Right?
Well, I think basically, I mean, you can't really use Facebook for any kind of collaboration because you can't upload any images unless they're, without feeling, unsure it's going to get censored. And you're not just getting censored, your whole account can get closed because of that. And so why bother, because then it's always clear, this is where we're in, you can't collaborate if the street is paved in front of you.
The email discussion list is still the best format for collaboration,
really?
as far as I'm concerned.
Really?
Yeah. It's clunky, but you really
it's
get
so
this.
clunky.
Yeah, no, it's really clunky. But that's
Let's
too much smoothness.
do you know how many Facebook users you need to collect in order to inflict a democratic decision on Facebook's own governance? I think you need to gather about one-third or two-thirds of the entire user base of Facebook in order to be able to inflict that sort of decision. So you need to have billions of friends, literally, in order to do that.
Is that legal?
What's that?
To have a billion of friends?
Probably not where you come from. Sorry. But,
because there's not a billion people there. Come on.
no, but I mean, the entire user base. So and one
Why
other
would that
thing.
be illegal in Austria?
Because in Austria we still care about the idea of the public,
Yeah.
right? And the coffee house.
Yeah,
The
that's
Vienna
right.
coffee
Yeah.
house.
That
Yeah,
actually still works.
birthplace of Middle European democracy.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
but another thing is, how does Facebook, even I'm not on Facebook, but how does it structure interaction elsewhere? I know of an art school in Holland where now crits are being given for the work that's pinned on the wall, and the way to actually judge the work is by pinning thumbs up signs next to the works. So this is a completely offline crit that still uses Facebook, the absent Facebook as a structural force in a way. So that's where Facebook is also present, not just when we're all on Facebook, but also when we're not on Facebook. That's the school
It's
where.
changed what being a friend means.
Well, it made it broader,
Yeah.
right? Which maybe good.
Hi, I just wanted to bring the conversation from Facebook onto Twitter, because there seems to be a preference for Twitter among the panel. I know there is Ben, but I don't know the other panel's position. But I know that Twitter is now being used by companies, they're creating their own followers. So these followers don't really exist as individuals, but it's this big business now. You can pay someone to sit at home and create hundreds of Twitter followers for you every day, and I just wonder what that might mean in terms of companies creating their own virtual communities that don't really exist.
I think it's sweet.
I also think it's awesome. I think it's totally absurd because who cares about about, how many followers, this Nestle has got on Twitter. I mean, what's less interesting?
What, you mean you're not worried about your grammar school?
Yeah, no, but seriously, but they're still investing into it. It's like, that's the way, like, they're totally manic about it. Oh, we need more followers, otherwise it's so uncool, because then it looks like people don't like this. Like, yeah, of course nobody likes you. People are just thirsty, that's all. And you know that their followers are fake. I mean,
it's good in a way because it promotes a kind of cynicism
Yeah.
about that whole kind of.
Well, it means that pseudonymity and anonymity are still possible on Twitter.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there's no real name policy for fake followers.
Because there's so many fake followers that if you're a real person on Twitter, people can't be sure that you're real.
Right. You can
So
even have
it's
your
really-
background. You can even edit your background so that the verified sign appears next to your name, and you can put that in your background.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do that tomorrow.
I mean,
yeah, it's really cute. Yeah.
you can buy like 1,000 followers for like $10 or something. But I think what's more interesting about this is how you
You
can
wouldn't
like
want to do that in real life, though.
you can kind of like it's not just that you can buy followers online now. It's also that you can rent an apartment that isn't your own. It changes the perception of people coming to dinner with you. So you could use Airbnb, you can go on casting call websites, and you can pick not just the kind of actor you want, exactly what they look like, or their traits, like the lowering of the cost for fraud and constructing complete fake realities and all of that kind of stuff is like incredibly bountiful. And I find it slightly shocking that more people that are coming to produce stuff in this space now at a younger age and are experiencing it for the first time aren't seeing that. And they're not being like, I can go on freelancer.com and I can hire somebody for $10 to do X, Y, or Z.
To do my job.
Well, I mean, no one would ever do that, right? Like,
No,
you never
no.
outsource all your work for like half the amount. God.
No, it was in Southend where I lived. That was in the local newspaper.
Mhm.
Someone went to jail because he'd outsourced his job to someone.
Yeah.
Why is that illegal?
I don't know. I can't remember.
I thought it was smart.
I thought
But
it was
smart's
pretty
not
smart.
good, though. Smart's not good.
That's too smart.
Yeah. Suspiciously smart.
Are there any other questions? One here and then you.
Yeah, just to come back to the question of democratisation, I think I kind of agree with you that it is a term that maybe we want to dismiss to an extent, where maybe it is also synonymous with dilution, or just like it's kind of bland, kind of, so everyone's putting Tumblr photos or everyone's on Instagram, so what, it doesn't mean that stuff is good. But I think it is interesting from an art world perspective, where you think like, is the art world, or is art just for, say, that has been historically like just a small group of collectors, small group of, like more of an elite structure, and that does still affect what we're doing now, because it's really important that if there's always like interesting activity online, that it has some correlation maybe at some point in real life, or has an audience, or maybe not, but
I really agree with you. I'm all for I'm all for the democratisation of art, because I think the more people that are actually being thoughtful and reflective about their lives and sharing that process with other people through whatever means it actually means, we want more of it. We do want more of that. We want to create more space for useless in by which I mean unproductive, unmoney-making activity. The more space we can create for that, for more people, the better.
But does that exist on pre-existing networks?
Yeah, I mean, it exists on non-digital networks. It exists all over the place. But people are spending a lot of time online, so hopefully that they'll do it there as well.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone?
Yeah, I just feel like, obviously, I mean, if you look at the art market these days, it's just primarily, pretty clearly, it's up to no good. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's just really ridiculous, and I mean, not that it has been glorious in the past, like terrible downfall, but it's become such an enormous well, it's called a market, and markets have become so extremely important that it's just an investment market. And but the art market doesn't have so much to do with the art world. So as long as you're not going to art fairs and stuff, blah, and so on, and being interested in private collections, I think art on this level is, pretty democratic, as you can, you'll find your little fetish that you got in your art, anywhere on the net. So that's not the issue. I think, of course, this is where internet obviously delivers, because you don't have the middleman of someone working and curating a museum. If you're really interested in whatever art form, you'll find it, as you find anything else on the net still, if you just look for it. But that again, that's a cultural aspect, and that doesn't have so much to do with the production of art itself. I understand what you mean. Obviously there should be, but I still don't get why that's a question of democracy, because you can have the most evil dictator saying we need lots of space for stuff, I don't see the correlation with democracy.
Benign dictator.
It's off.
But let's say that this line of defense, or this line of attack that you propose about the enormous amount of space for uselessness, it was the line of defense for art that the Dutch arts institutions had when they were threatened with cuts a couple of years back.
It's not a very strong argument.
No, so you saw people, instead of a really militant defense for art, and it was a defense on the human values embodied by art, those sort of things, the sort of the space for expression, those things. And, funding cut, end of story. So institutions dealing with art need to have I feel personally, because I'm not an institution, I feel need to have a very, very strong story about why they are needed and why the things that they support are needed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of those things, one of the issues around that idea of democratizing something and everybody being able to see it and stuff, I think one of the key hang-ups that still is super prevalent in the art world, and many artists still want that validation of knowing that you're going to be in that part of the history book, and I don't think I kind of think that it's not necessary, and the sooner that we kind of get over those things, the sooner we can start participating in furry communities on Tumblr and stuff like that, and it being a slightly more horizontal space. It is because it takes putting something like the Bernadette Corporation in the ICA to append that validity of the form. I think that we don't need
that might be true for some people. It isn't true for everyone, though. I think it's a dangerous thing to assert that is an absolute truth.
No, what? The validation, the desire for validation. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I hang on.
Most artists I know just want to have food and housing.
Yeah, but there is a certain degree of aspiration and a feeling of trodden downness, and we start to veer into topics of graduate with no future, and people that are left art school with this hope of being in a gallery system that is massively oversaturated, is collapsing, doesn't have enough money to keep itself alive. Or we could take a step back and be well, actually, it turns out we've got some tools to form some organisations, and let's just be happy with our project spaces. Don't know.
Now at last I understand what you were proposing.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so you were proposing a survival method, basically. A survival method whereby artists can be working in the world they want to be working in.
Yes, but it's not survival, right? It's better space.
Yeah. Well, survival would be quite a deep. Yeah.
Uh-oh.
There was one there, right?
Here it comes.
I've got to take exception to the way the word democracy and democratization is being used. It seems in most of these situations where it's being quoted today as the paradigm where people are free to see what they want. This is nothing to do with democracy. Democracy is a system of government that is to do with the way in which the individual's vote is represented in the makeup of their government itself. It's absolutely nothing to do with democracy that you can Google image search whatever you like. In many ways we're talking about the paradigm maybe of classic liberalism or an attitude to censorship, but this has nothing to do with the democratization of the internet or democracy itself. Why do we keep resorting to this term? To to describe the making of social networks. If anything, a network which only you are party to and only you can see the images of therein, for example, your Facebook or your Twitter, constitutes perhaps one of the most elitist paradigms of society we ever see. It's a society in which only you are allowed to participate, and your password protected to make sure that others do not enter. Why are you using democracy to describe those conditions?
Well, I think there's a reason for that, because it's a technological reason. Because basically, of course, democracy is a form of a voting system in the end, and so on. But on the net, if you look at something, you're already doing a thumbs up in the end. You know, it's okay. This gets your attention, and as everything's being monitored. I don't mean that in the paranoid way, but it's being monitored. So if you look at something, this will survive longer, and more of this will be generated. So just the market of attention is just will reflect on future choices that we will have. And of course, it's an absurd notion of the word democracy, and I think it's very neoliberal. I totally agree. That's why also I'm kind of disgusted
It's
by
quite
it.
dangerous. I mean, when we talk about, for example,
But it's
conflicts that are
realistic.
ongoing in Syria or the wars that have taken place in the Middle East, where democracy is used as an agent of the instigation of those conflicts, where
Yeah.
these are life or death issues, and that we are talking about it's a social good to give these people more democracy. For us to then look to debate networks and to use this term in a way I think actually is nothing to do
But do you
with
think that
meaning.
it's been used in the sense that that would be a positive aspiration of networks?
I just think in the context of what, for example, the debate that happened that's ongoing this evening, some really salient and interesting points are being made, but a term that has nothing to do with them is being used to describe it, like kind of to feel it out, like a prosthesis.
But it is connected. But I mean, look like something like a vase, right? And where you just go like, oh, vote for this. What's how it's called? What do they call it? This cause. Exactly, it's a cause, which is a word that does come from Facebook, right? And if you then have like 2 million people going for this cause, and then everybody is really aware, obviously, as we all know, awareness helps no one, and but it's a very political thing. And you don't know who's behind these causes. I remember, if you talk about Syria, which I'm extremely interested in, there was very early on in the Syria conflict, there was this huge Abbas cause, and it was really strange. It was like, support rebels and so on and blah, and I felt like, I'm not supporting any rebels right there, because I know it's what am I actually supposed to be supporting, who's proposing this. But your vote, your thumbs up, becomes a mean that's used in so-called democratic processes. People they don't take it seriously, but they use it in the political arena. And I think it's awesome that you really feel uneasy with the usage of the word democracy in this context. But I think this is where we
vote
are
and
at
thumbs
the
up as
moment.
analogous. I don't want to turn it. Sorry, I don't mean to turn it into a dialogue, but vote and thumbs up are not analogous. A ballot where your options are yes or abstain is not a vote.
What I'm trying to say is, by now, your thumbs up has a representation in the political arena, and and therefore becomes a vote, not a direct vote, but one that travels via some commission or plenum or whatever. But it's not just like, if you say you like something online and you end up being a huge group of people liking something, it does have an effect on governance.
Yeah,
You
but
like
what
it or
effect?
not.
I mean, I think he's right in terms that democracy is about collective decision making in some extent. And you could say that if 5,000 people like something, there's still no decision coming out of that. All the signatures of a Navas petition don't actually lead to a decision. They are a factor of influence.
But it's then
Yeah.
used. It's then used as, well, the public is for this.
Right.
And it's being misused most of the time, I think. We should always be really suspicious in this context. So in that way, and democracy is, I don't think so much about, finding a common opinion or whatever, but it's just like the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
That's what it is, and this really relates to 200 million thumbs up.
But there's a wider resonance with what you just said, in that words that are associated with good human values are constantly overtaken, used and abused by corporations, essentially. So friendship, liking, causes, who wouldn't want those things, and then, okay, so now we're going to use them to work out how many 40-year-old women are going to use diet pills or what have you, so it's this kind of abuse of language happens a lot, and the abuse of very particular kinds of relationships, and everything becomes really hard to kind of stay clear about what it is that you're speaking about, so I think you make a really good point. And then politicians start using that, they get down with the kids and they're using these things in very kind of murky terms, and we all start to lose the ability to speak with any kind of clear, with any accuracy.
I think, do we need to wrap up around 8?
Do another couple of questions.
Okay, are there any more questions? Hugh, sorry.
I thought it was very interesting you used the RAND report talking about tribes, institutions, markets and networks, and I think there's a really interesting trend recently that we're still thinking that perhaps artists, collectives are on the cutting edge of this of an avant-garde of culture, whereas I think the trend that we've actually seen really is a move back, that the artist collective's role in this sort of network culture is actually a step back from the expansive role of the network into the market, and it's actually consolidating a lot of the value of what is perceived as the value of the network and then bringing it back into the marketplace. So for example, some of what I think are the most interesting cultural manifestations online of networks are decentralized without a name, but operating in a sort of, like Daniel said, as non-organisations operating as organisations. So examples of this would probably be something like 4chan or Weird Twitter, or like Twitter Maoist or something on a much smaller scale. We're actually getting a really interesting cultural development coming out without pinning itself to a name, which has a different sort of level of participation. You can come in and operate as an organisation to create some sort of cultural product or manifestation, and then see back. And what actually a lot of artists who are working on that same genre are doing are then trying to pull that back under a collective name. That sort of tension. So a group like Lucky PDF who are then taking the value of these networks and sucking it back into a collective name in order to marketise it. And that's kind of, when I was talking about this sort of saving this use of the word democracy on the hashtag, and is there a comment that sort of, could you, rather than thinking of it as in the model of representational democracy where you institutionalise power and choose things within that institution, actually the really exciting networks are enacting a sort of mob democracy, which could be, I'm happy to admit, could easily be the tyranny of the majority. To operate where people can operate and produce things culturally without putting their name to it. And so I'm basically interested in your response to the idea that these groups are actually sucking out and trying to, the art is acting as actually a really conservative call to order on the really exciting things that are happening on internet culture by trying to pull it back within names, and that's what sort of internet art its role is to do, is to put this culture back into its marketable box.
You said a lot of very interesting things there. I just don't think you can generalise like that. I don't think there's only one thing going on. I think there is that going on, but I think there's a lot of other things going on as well.
Well, it's interesting that the way that 4chan emerged as a sort of manga or anime image board, where the rule of anonymity or the possibility of anonymity was really part of the setup of the system, and that is a kind of setup that has generated anonymous, and that has generated really important networks that have very strong political consequences. The problem is in the long-term goals and maintenance of these organizational forms. So you can be anonymous, and anonymous will continuously reinvent itself. It might come out under different names, different objectives, etc. But the thing is that the only way for that to happen is to keep evolving. So for a member of Anonymous to sort of define Anonymous as their practice, there will always be another thing into the existence of the Anonymous member that is actually crucial to that creates a kind of backbone or base structure on which this can happen. But then again, I agree with you that the idea of denouncing the name, denouncing to be known as, we're all sitting here with our first and last names and our collective names, and there's a whole bunch of people that we work with that don't get mentioned because we are sitting here, with these names. I think that is a crucial. Is great. It's crucial.
I'm sitting in the spotlight somewhere else around the world at this very moment.
I really want to take myself out of that because I'm not sitting here with my first and my last name.
That's true.
I've always been working on my whatever special name.
That's true. But you have a pseudonym. You have a pseudonym or of sorts, right?
Lizvlx, yeah.
Yeah.
And we have been releasing quite a set of projects. And which we never released under our own name.
No.
A lot later on, we would say that was us and so on. But stuff like Gold Auction, of course, we didn't release under an artist brand because then it would have been absolutely powerless.
Mm-hmm.
It should be just stupid phone game or whatever.
Right.
And I see lots of people doing that now, and it's not my problem. Let's put it that way.
But what?
Huh?
Like Bitcoin.
Bitcoin is so boring. We talked about it yesterday. It's like, why would you be interested in money markets? And we're recreating another one. I mean, we're going to start new Bitcoins now. Yeah. It's going to be a lot better. It's going to get more airtime, and it's going to be on a better network.
Yeah, but what to just say something, one more thing about that comment. The fact is that 4chan, but also Pastebin and other tools are tools that are built with a certain looseness around them, so that they are appropriate tools to be not only used but also in a productive way misused by their users. And the more airtight that the communicative tools of the network become, in terms of being circumscribed around proprietary elements, monitoring, surveillance, real name policies, in a way the less scalable those tools are, or useful those tools become for scaling, politically disruptive practices and ideas.
I'll respond a little bit as well in terms of that relationship with Anonymous. I think that what we're kind of experiencing in this moment is Anonymous growing up and deciding when to kill somebody and when not to kill somebody. Those kind of decisions actually actively being made now. If you see all of the stuff that kind of happened around the Boston bomber and stuff like that, you're seeing the maturing of this network that for a long time has been terrorizing the internet, but also finding people that kill cats and stuff like that. And I think with artists that are operating whether under collective names or in this space as kind of collectives or avatars, the need to begin to take responsibility for one's actions in a space where you can have a greater effect on things hasn't hit home yet. I think that's basically the art world provides a very safe space for fucking around with one's personal responsibility, and that would be my kind of direct response to the kind of activity of young artist collectors at the moment. Maybe it's a bit hardline.
Fucking about and taking no responsibility. There's a lot of that going on as well.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, this talk about Twitter, Facebook and sort of various other tools, they're all written by someone, so the use of choice is limited, and then all this activity on networks is all happening on large corporations' servers. So, what can we really do about that?
actually what we can do.
Yeah.
Well, rapidly there's this move towards decentralizing server stacks. And so if you get high-powered supercomputers and people work really hard to create there's a hashtag that's coming up on Twitter in the last week of the People's Cloud, that might be an effective move around that kind of stuff. But we're a long way behind developing that technology, and it has to happen super fast. But since the Occupy movement, that has begun to happen in these kind of distributed systems.
It is a preoccupation of a lot of artists in our network. It's things that they are looking at. They're working with their own free and open source community software. They're not reliant on the things that are out there. They're building systems that are free and open, so they'll be able to continue to modify them. And it is an important thing, and a lot of people that are thinking about it.
Yeah, I think we are getting closer to
Well, it's always been possible. I mean, it's never been an issue because people have, collaborated with long time pre-Twitter. So it was never an issue. You just need a server and the login, make the server secure, and then you chat on the server.
But people move to Twitter and Facebook because it's where millions of people are.
But if you want to collaborate, you don't need millions of people.
No. If you want attention.
Exactly, but that's not really collaboration.
Yeah.
And
But there's a difference between an intranet and an internet. You know, what you're describing is basically a collaborative intranet. And what the network power of Twitter, Facebook, and all the social media is exactly in the fact that people join it because they feel that otherwise they might be excluded from something, or they might miss something, experience social death, as some authors called it. And then, it turns out you can do all these things with these tools. And before you know, your entire sort of political life is on a server in South Carolina.
I know, but I don't think that's really true for the regular new media artist. I mean,
No, but who is the regular new media artist?
Well, I know you know what I mean. I mean, anybody who calls himself a new media artist and just
what are
uses
new media?
What are new media?
Yeah.
Well, it's not video.
I didn't say that.
I said what I just said. You can call it whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
But
we have to enhance this with Fox News, Fox News character to debate. Okay. Yeah.
I think we should wrap up.
All right.
Thanks everyone for coming.